Welcome to today's AVITH in Context webinar. I'm Carolyn Davies, a Senior Project Officer at the Centre for Excellence in Child and Family Welfare, which is the peak body in Victoria and Tasmania for child and family services. I'll begin by acknowledging country and acknowledge that we are all joining today, wherever we are, from Aboriginal land. The centre is based on Wurundjeri land. Sovereignty was never ceded. This land was stolen, and we respect the resilience of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community in the face of this trauma and respect their right to and aspiration for self-determination and empowerment. We acknowledge the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as the rightful custodians, pay respect to any First Nations colleagues joining us today. The AVITH in Context webinar series is where we hear from a range of professionals in various fields, exploring the different contexts and presenting issues that impact a young person from using violence, as well as their family members. The session will be recorded today, so if you have colleagues who want to catch up on this later on, they can. We're going to be talking about some heavy content in this session. We're talking about the impacts of child maltreatment, and because of the nature of this research, it can be quite a clinical perspective. So I just want to preface this conversation to say that although, we are hearing about basically, some awful experiences that people may have experienced earlier in life, I guess it's part of our professional role to hold that space for hope and to know that people can and do recover from trauma. So we have these webinar sessions to spotlight the need for therapeutic intervention and support. And we've spoken just before offline with presenters around this issue, and we were talking about how the brain is very adaptive and has the ability to change. So please just keep that in mind when we are having this discussion today. So our presenters are part of the research team at Deakin University, who will be exploring the links between childhood maltreatment and aggression in adults, in particular the moderating role of neurocognitive ability and substance use. While this research doesn't look specifically at that life stage of adolescence or young adulthood, some of the findings have sort of fairly obvious implications for various stages throughout the life journey. I'm not going to introduce the topic anymore. I will let them do that. But first, I'll just briefly introduce our speakers for you. We have Dr. Ashley Curtis, who is a lecturer in the School of Psychology at Deakin University and is stream leader of the Experiences of Harm in Vulnerable Populations group within the Connect Research and Training Initiative in SEED. Ashley's research focuses on the factors that impact aggressive and violent behaviour across the lifespan in community, clinical and forensic settings, including substance use, trauma and neurocognitive impairment. Her research identifies relevant factors for aggression and violence intervention and ways to improve engagement with intervention to reduce aggressive and violent behaviour. Dr. Travis Harries is an associate lecturer in psychology at Deakin University in Victoria and is a member of the Connect Research and Training Initiative within the Centre for Social and Early Emotional Development. His research area is family violence with a specific focus on child-to-parent violence and parent-directed aggression. His research explores the family conditions which might predispose and perpetuate child-to-parent violence, with an emphasis on dynamic risk factors which can be modified through formal interventions. He also works in the intimate partner violence space, understanding how early life experiences, including child-to-parent violence, contribute to the experience of partner violence later in adulthood. And Dr. David Skvark is a senior lecturer in the School of Psychology, where he specialises in research methods and data science. Dr. Skvark, or Dave, as he has asked me to call him, has published extensively in the fields of behavioural and cognitive science, with specific interest in detecting cognitive impairments. So quite a mouthful of an introduction there. So this team, suffice to say, have spent quite a lot of time researching and thinking about this topic. I'm going to hand over to them and let them share their research and their screen. Over to you guys. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Carolyn, and thank you for that introduction. We're really grateful to be here to talk about this work. It's something that we have been talking about for a long time and are really glad to see it come together in this paper that we're going to talk about today. But we'll talk more broadly as well about some of our other work and how it kind of plays into some of the findings from this as well. So, we're going to talk about child maltreatment and adult aggressive behaviour and the moderating role of neurocognitive impairment and substance use, as Carolyn mentioned. Um, Travis has jumped ahead for me here, very keen on my slides. I just really want to quickly, before I do this acknowledgement, just acknowledge the co-authors for this paper. So Tani Gwala, Professor Peter Entercott and Professor Peter Miller as well. And just note that this study was funded by an Alfred Deakin postdoctoral fellowship as well. Before we jump in, I will do an acknowledgement of country. So we just want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of all the unceded lands, skies and waterways on which we're all coming together today. And we pay our deep respect to the ancestors and elders of Wadawurrung country where we are coming from today. So what we're going to talk about today is essentially the structure of the paper, but we're going to go into a bit more detail about how this really applies across the lifespan, not just focusing on adulthood. So we'll start with just talking about child maltreatment and the impact that it has on neurocognitive function and on aggression. And we'll bring in substance use and talk more about its role as well and what all of this really means for how we work with people who have experienced maltreatment and who are engaging in aggressive behavior. And we'll talk about implications, as I said, for both adults and young people as we do that. So I'm actually going to hand over to Travis, who is going to go through some of the background for us.
Thank you, Ashley. So we've got well, there's decades of research now to show that the experience of maltreatment in childhood, and when we say that, we mean emotional and physical abuse and neglect, that this causes aggression in childhood and adulthood. Now, it's not the only cause, and it's certainly not the only possible outcome of maltreatment, but the pathway is causal, and because of that, these experiences of maltreatment must factor into any attempts to change aggressive behavior across the lifespan. We currently understand that there are a few ways by which maltreatment might make aggression more likely, and these apply to both children and adults. Though you can imagine by adulthood, there's potentially been a lot of reinforcement taking place over the years as well. So the social learning principles at play, we tend to model the behavior the adults around us use because it's really the only indicator we have as children as to what might be adaptive in our environment. And certainly aggression in an environment of maltreatment can be very adaptive at that time. We also know that environments where there's maltreatment, they're inherently very unpredictable. Caregivers are often inconsistently responsive, inconsistently harsh for a number of reasons. But this is very difficult for that young person to adapt to compared to a more consistent environment. And what we see is that this encourages a development of a life strategy that focuses on high risk behaviors for short-term gain, like aggression, because that future is very uncertain. And that final mechanism, I don't need to tell you that these environments are stressful and lead the young person to being in a more constant state of stress response. It's chronic rather than fleeting, which is how our stress responses should be. And it's this extended stress response, among some other things, that can impact on how our brains develop and adapt to the world that we find ourselves trying to, or these young people find themselves trying to survive in. Um, but this effect on brain development and the consequences for aggression and intervention, they've received a lot less attention than we would argue that they should have, given how proximal and consistent the effect on behavior is. Now, to understand how childhood maltreatment affects behavior, we need to do a little bit of a crash course or understand how the brain typically functions. And I should have put an anatomically correct brain here to evidence this, but we've got we've got whatever's on the screen. But at the core of the brain, structures like the brain stem, these handle automatic life-sustaining functions like breathing and reflexes. So, for example, if you touch a hot stove, the brain stem initiates that reflex that you have to pull your hand away instantly. Moving more outward to the limbic system, which is kind of behind the center eye, I guess, of that of that picture. This regulates your fight or flight response. It triggers adrenaline when we face danger. However, there are higher order structures near the surface, like the frontal lobe, and these play a key role in controlling those automatic responses. So, for instance, while the limbic system might increase your breathing rate during stress, it's the frontal lobe that allows you to consciously slow that down and reduce that fight or flight response. And this conscious control or inhibitory control, we'll refer to it as, it's a part of a broader set of processes that come under executive function, which includes things like decision making, planning, behavioral regulation. Trauma, like childhood maltreatment, it disrupts this balance. And so that chronic stress increases the sensitivity to threats and overactivates those survival, more basic regions of the brain, like the limbic system, while also hindering the development of our frontal cortex. And it's this rewiring that reduces executive function and making it harder to regulate impulses or process complex information. And over time, these changes can contribute to conditions like post-traumatic stress disorder, where the brain is really hyper attuned to danger at the expense of rational control. And what we see when we study people who behave aggressively is that these same neurobiological, neurocognitive impairments that result from maltreatment, they pop up again. There's huge overlap. And these impairments are not just correlated or co-occurring with aggression by virtue of some third variable like the need for self-defense, something like that. The impairments themselves actually make a meaningful contribution to that behavior occurring. So those impairments in the front brain, the emotional brain, and the connectivity between them, it means that for people who have been maltreated, their experience and their perception of the world is vastly different to those who had safe upbringings. So, for example, that frontal cortex is responsible for doing things like interpreting facial expressions of emotion. And when this is underdeveloped, there's a much greater likelihood of misinterpreting or misperceiving neutral expressions of another person as negative or threatening emotions. So they're more likely to interpret someone as a threat. And when we're under threat, what we do is we're more likely to choose aggression as a means of addressing that threat. Again, not always, just more likely. We're also more likely to then interpret those outcomes as positive and something that we should probably do again. On top of that, there's less ability to then think through different options and control the behavior before it occurs. It's much more of a physiological response than a reasoned or rational choice. Sorry. So, in fact, the systems that we use to create choice in our minds are pretty much offline, and the more primordial systems that favor more basic human functions like aggression, they're working overtime. It's actually really hard for that person to withhold an aggressive response when their entire being is telling them, their entire brain is telling them, there's no other option and you better act quickly. And we've spoken about threat here. This is, of course, by no means objective. It's also augmented in people with maltreatment experiences. Even the smallest amount of uncertainty or loss of control can register as a threat as well, not things that those who've had a safe upbringing might necessarily think of as being threatening. And this may seem like a bit of a random tangent, but we also need to consider substance use in this story, because like aggression, substance use can also be a high risk behavior, also a coping behavior too, that's going to stem from maltreatment. And it's important. It's an important consideration because depending on the substance, there's an impact on those same brain regions that are impaired via maltreatment. And again, this increases on top of that the likelihood of aggressive behaviors. So things like cocaine and opioids, they're associated with impairments in cognitive flexibility, methamphetamine with cognitive control and poor decision making, and cannabis with things like working memory and processing speed. And these impairments, they can last beyond intoxication and they can become chronic too. So of course, it's not surprising where we see lots of aggression, we also typically see substance use and a magnifying of those neurocognitive impairments that facilitate the aggression. And where it gets a bit more complicated is that these same impairments that are associated with aggression and substance use that stem from maltreatment are also implicated in why our interventions for aggression don't tend to work as well or as consistently as we want them to. And Ashley's going to go into the specifics here later as it relates to our research. So I'll just flag the general concept here. But basically, it's one thing for us to have evidence-based treatments, and we absolutely should pursue and implement the best interventions in the world. But if the person receiving that intervention can't engage, then it's no better than an intervention that doesn't work. And this we refer to as this idea of intervention responsivity, that the intervention needs to be responsive to the needs, the individual needs of that consumer, for lack of a better word. And you can probably see where this is going, but you can imagine how someone with neurocognitive impairments that's spoken about might go in something like a CBT heavy intervention, or any intervention where there's a strong focus on things like decision making, on consequences, on controlling emotion and engaging in rational thought. Yes, it's true, the individual will certainly have room for improvement in these areas, and it's a need that needs to be worked on, but that will also obstruct them from engaging and making progress in these domains from time to time. We know the brain regions impacted control our ability to pay attention, to encode new information, to remember that new information, to set appropriate goals and ways of reaching them, to integrate feedback, adapting to new environments, our cognitions, our affect. It's broad reaching. And just as a basic example, someone with these experiences simply might not remember what's covered in the intervention after it ends. And no matter how it might look, this is a physiological limitation for them. And so we're at somewhat of a high risk of overwhelming these individuals and potentially losing them from intervention as well, or getting slow intervention responses, for the very reason that they're in intervention in the first place, which is a little bit ironic. And sorry to be bleak, we do have some better news in just a moment. Just to recap, because I put out a lot of information. So we know that maltreatment can interrupt and disrupt the development of executive functions. And this is responsible for things like decision making, responsive vision, attention, memory, so on. We know that this disruption then impacts on decision making throughout a child's life and into adulthood. And this can lead them to engage in risky behaviors like heavy substance use and aggressive behavior. And these don't occur in isolation. They tend to co-occur, and both of them are related to impaired neurocognitive ability. And it's these same neurocognitive impairments that develop from trauma, which will also impact on the delivery of intervention programs. What we don't know, and this is where our study comes in, is how this experience of maltreatment, use of substances, neurocognitive impairment work together to influence aggression. We don't know their cumulative impact. And that's really important for things like planning, resources within intervention and so on. And so that's what our study did. We assessed the cumulative impact of childhood maltreatment, substance use, and neurocognitive ability on aggressive behavior in adulthood. I will be quiet for a moment and pass on to Dave.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Trav. So my role here is to talk a little bit more about the methodology we took in undertaking this research, particularly around the thing I want to focus on a little bit more is explaining. We've spoken a lot about executive functions. We've spoken a lot about what we might call governing functions. So that's that conscious control over things that are more automatic, like fight or flight. And I want to just talk a little bit more about how we've actually decided this is what's happening within a person, or when someone's got something going on in their brain, how we've been able to bring it from the inside to the outside so we can see it again. So a little bit of background about our actual study itself. So we recruited predominantly through an online sample, but we specifically went into spaces where we knew we would get people with, generally speaking, a higher, not predisposition, but a higher proportion or a higher likelihood of reporting more aggressive or violent behaviors in the past 12 months. So we contacted places like clinical services who do lots of work in terms of dealing with people with troubles with aggressive behavior, but also other cognitive difficulties. And we also spoke to justice services around Victoria. You can see here that our sample is not overly large, but it is what we would consider to be relatively representative. It's what we call a powerful sample, meaning that if we are going to detect things that happen, if we are going to observe relationships where we might say something like, we know that this thing leads to this other thing, we've got enough people to be confident that that's really what's going on. You can see here we've got just under 180, under 180 participants, relatively middle-aged and predominantly female. This is a relatively typical sample for the sorts of, I suppose, populations we're interested in, but also reflecting the idea that we're generally speaking with people who tend to be more receptive to online studies like ours. So it's not necessarily going to be a perfect one-to-one match to your own experiences or your own practices, or maybe even some of the other research that you may have seen, but we're confident that this should be broadly applicable. Okay, next slide, please, Trav. Pardon me. Okay, so the data that we recorded was predominantly through self-report. And so what we would do is we would link people into these surveys that we put online, this place through Qualtrics, and we would just ask some questions. So we would ask some questions about their childhood experiences, particularly related to what the questionnaire was called a trauma questionnaire. But you can see that in the different aspects that we've measured here, we do have lots of different things that we would consider to be maltreatment. The things that we focused on most heavily were things like physical abuse, physical neglect, and emotional neglect. There is a little bit more information that we can pull out of this questionnaire when we return to our research in a future date. But ultimately, we were kind of limited a little bit by the practicalities of we wanted to get this information out as broadly as we could, as soon as we could, and to as many people as we could. And so one of the practicalities we had to deal with was, well, basically the journal said, you've got 4,000 words to talk about this, and we had to pick our battles. So the future research is going to delve more into some of these specific types of abuse and neglect and really pull these apart to a greater extent. But I'm mostly going to focus on what we broadly call emotional maltreatment, which is a combination of physical abuse and physical neglect, and emotional maltreatment, which is emotional abuse and emotional neglect. You can also see that we've recorded things like aggression, and we've recorded it in different ways. So we've recorded the aggressive behaviors in terms of whether someone is responding, what we would call a reactive form of aggression. So someone who generally may not be particularly aggressive, but if they perceive that someone's being aggressive to them, they will react in kind. So the example that I always use is if I'm driving on the highway and someone cuts me off, that reactive aggressive behavior might be that I'm going to, I don't know, do something silly in my car. Not saying I do that, but you know, we also have what I think is also a really interesting form of aggressive behavior, which is what we call this proactive aggression behavior. So this is using aggression in a planned way in advance in some way, usually to achieve some goal. So it may be something in terms of like deciding that you're going to try and use physical intimidation, even assault, verbally abuse someone. It might even be something as straightforward as, I've been overcharged on my phone bill, so I'm going to get on the phone and I'm going to start yelling at someone until I get someone to fix this for me. That's planned aggressive behavior, and it's what we would call proactive. There's a lot of overlap between these things. So some things we might say appear to be reactive, and typically when we talk about reactive aggressive, we're usually talking about things that happen relatively in the moment. So I'm reacting to something that's just happened to me. Someone's just said something I don't like. Someone's bumped into me on the train. Someone's done X, Y, and Z. So I'm going to react now. When we start talking about proactive aggression, this is usually when we start talking about greater distance between us and whatever aggressive act that we're going to do. So even though I might engage in some kind of aggression in retaliation, so again, someone bumps into me on the train, someone's rude to me at work, I might then plan to retaliate and be aggressive. So these different things, or what we're, I guess, presenting as different types of aggression, or you'll often see presented as different types of aggression, they're basically the same thing. There are different means and there are different methods and there are different reasons why someone is aggressive, but the net result is basically the same. Okay, thanks, Trav. Okay, so Trav has spoken a lot about these different brain mechanisms, these different brain organs, these different processes that happen relatively automatically. So those ones that go very deep into our primitive brain, moving outwards to things that are much more, for lack of a better word, evolved, advanced. These are the things that we engage in our governing control. Now, it's difficult to get a perfect measurement of what is going on in someone's brain. And so what we do in order to try and measure these things is we come up with different tasks that we think will basically approximate the thing that we want. So if we're talking about, for example, we want to know how good is someone at detecting subtle rules or rule changes, or when, say, something is different, or when, I suppose, a context changes in a way that you now need to respond to, what we might call cognitive flexibility. We come up with these different tasks that, in a way, for lack of a better word again, trick people into telling us what that process is like for them. So you can see we've got a handful of different examples here on the screen. I won't go through them in a great deal of detail, except to, I suppose, try and connect some of these tasks with what it might look like for you as a person. So we've got this thing here called the modified card sorting test, which is a form of cognitive flexibility, or also being able to detect what I like to think of is changing rules or changing context, even if it doesn't necessarily make sense even if there isn't any indication that the rules of the game have changed. So a person is given a series of cards, and without any other indication, they get shown 4 cards. They get told to pick the right one. They get no other information, just pick the right card. They'll select one of the 4 and they'll be told, yes, that's the one I wanted, or no, that isn't. And then over time, they'll begin to work out that the card that they're supposed to pick has a certain characteristic, such as it has a certain color. And the person will say, okay, the correct card to pick every time is a red one. And so they'll keep picking the red card. They'll keep getting this thing saying they're correct. And then at some point, unbeknownst to the participant, they'll select a red card, and then they'll get this big flashing red light that says, no, wrong. And so they understand then that the rule has changed, but once again, they don't know what that rule is. Now, what we find is that people who are typically developing, people who have what we would say at least normal or normative cognitive control, they adapt to this fairly quickly. So they'll immediately say something like, oh, okay, something's changed. I've got to figure out the next rule. People who struggle with this tend to keep making the same mistake over and over again. So this is someone who says, oh, okay, I thought it was red. Maybe I clicked the wrong card. They click red again. And so what we are able to do by detecting the amount of errors or the time it takes someone to work out the correct rule, we can figure out how adaptable someone is to changing context, changing rules, even if they're not given any explicit instruction that those rules have changed or what they might be. We've got other things here relating to decision-making. So particularly decision-making, what we use here is a form of gambling task. So people have to make decisions about what move they're going to make next on the basis of if they make the right move, they're going to earn some fictional money. We don't give them any money, but there is a way to get, you could think of it as earning points. When we're talking about earning this, we can see, and what we do is we present the participant with what we would consider to be a clearly better decision, a better choice. If you take this option, it's lower risk for lower reward, but we've also got higher risk, higher reward options. But the way that the game is set is that if you continually choose those high risk, high rewards, the risk actually massively outweighs the reward. So someone with good decision-making capabilities will fairly quickly realize it's actually not worth the effort to go for those high risk, high reward situations. They'll continually pick the safe option, and therefore they'll end the game with much more money, quote unquote, higher points than if they chose higher risky things, if they made poorer decisions. Sorry, can I just go back one? Sorry, just very quickly, Trav, without sort of rushing us on. Without me rushing you on. What we've got here, probably one of the key things that's going to come up over and over again is this idea of response inhibition. So this is something that Trav was talking about earlier, the idea that we have these things that happen automatically and we need to attempt to inhibit them. So again, someone's been rude to me, someone's bumped into me on the train. I need to inhibit that automatic response to react aggressively. What we've got here is a task which specifically asks people to do something repetitive and mindless and fast, but at random intervals, they're going to be told to stop. This is difficult for people. This is difficult to do, particularly if you start getting into a rhythm or a momentum. And again, something starts becoming automatic and unconscious. And that's what we're tapping into here. The final two we have here, again, another method of cognitive control, making a decision quickly in the face of something difficult being presented to you, a choice that is fast and needs to be automatic, but also requires your cognitive control. So you can see the example here. You're given a piece of information. So if you see a blue square, click this button. If you see a red square, click something else. And you're very quickly shown a bunch of information that you have to respond to. It's very hard to do. Finally, we have this idea of what we call working memory. So working memory is a key component of executive dysfunction or executive function more broadly, because this is the thing that governs or holds or manipulates information within your brain. So the key example that I always like to give is that I can remember my phone number very, very clearly automatically. It takes no effort at all for me to give it to someone if they wanted to. And I usually will give it into small chunks of numbers. So rather than saying all 10 digits, one after another with an even space, I'll usually say it in very, group of 4, group of 3, group of 3. I can give that information with very little effort, very automatically. But if someone were to say to me, you need to give that information, I want you to tell me your phone number and I want you to order it from smallest number to largest number, that's going to take me anywhere between 20 seconds to 4 hours with a pen and a pencil and a whiteboard. I'm just never going to be able to do it. And that's what we're talking about, that mental manipulation. And I encourage you to try it yourself. Think of your mobile phone number and then try and reorder it into higher to lower. When you're moving those numbers around, that's that mental manipulation. That's working memory. Okay, thanks, Trav. Okay, so we measured all these things. We gave all of our sample, all that, we detected or we measured all of that cognitive performance or those cognitive processes. We measured and detected as much of that childhood maltreatment as much as we could, and also the aggressive behaviors. When we found out, or when we got the end of our sample, it basically looked like this. We can see that about half of our sample, actually exactly half of our sample, reported experiencing both emotional and physical maltreatment in childhood. We can also see that if someone only experienced one kind of maltreatment, it was emotional maltreatment. That was about a third of the sample reported emotional maltreatment without any physical components. You can see it's a very small minority who either experienced no maltreatment at all, reported no maltreatment, or those who reported only physical maltreatment. So you can see that by and large, about 80% on nearly all of our sample reported being, I guess, experiencing physical maltreatment, and a very vanishingly small amount said none or just physical. Okay, thanks, Trav. So some of the responses and some of the information that we detected, or some of the statistical output that we found, was quite interesting. So, for example, we found a lot of different combinations of what we call combinations of variables that, when you combine them together, they predict something even more powerfully than if you knew one of those things. So, for example, what we found here is that people with higher levels of cognitive control and people with higher levels of alcohol risk. Well, we know that, alcohol risk. So alcohol risk is as you all know, I'm sure, is a strong predictor of aggressive behavior, or increases the likelihood of aggressive behavior. But if someone has stronger cognitive control abilities, it attenuates that risk substantially. So what this can mean is that if someone is a heavy alcohol user, a heavy substance user, or whatever that happens to be, if we can improve cognitive control, or if we can get someone to take a breath and work things through, we can very quickly, or at least very strongly, reduce that level of aggressive behavior, or the likelihood of aggressive behavior occurring. Likewise, we can see things like better decision-making specifically attenuates the risk that's associated with physical maltreatment. We find that better working memory specifically tends to counteract the risk involved in excessive drug use. And we generally find that maltreatment itself, emotional maltreatment, tends to be combined strongly with physical maltreatment. If you have them both, you tend to experience much greater, or report much greater, experiences of aggressive behavior. And so this is what we refer to as this combination of different things. These different factors coming together end up being more or better predictors of aggressive behavior or any outcome than any one individually. Okay, thanks, Trav. Next one. So all told, so we put a whole lot of things into our models. We worked very hard to try and find what is the single best combination of things that we measured, if we put them together, will be the strongest predictors, or the best predictors, or the thing that is our best guess at this person is more likely to engage in aggressive behavior or not. And so what we found is that if we combine these three things together, physical maltreatment, response inhibition being poor, and drug use risk being high, if you combine these three things together, your risk of engaging in aggressive behavior is massively increased than any one of these things individually. And interestingly, and I'm sure, again, this is probably not very surprising to you, physical maltreatment alone increases the likelihood of engaging in aggressive behavior. Drug use risk increases the risk of engaging in aggressive behavior. And having poorer response inhibition also increases that likelihood of engaging in behavior. So the combination of these things pretty much means that if you have poor response inhibition, and particularly if you have one of these more physical maltreatment and higher levels of drug use risk, your likelihood of engaging in aggressive behavior is substantially higher than if any one of these things was lower. So they combine to make things much worse, almost like a perfect storm. Okay, Trav. Okay, now I think this goes on to Ash. Thanks.
Thanks, Dave. So as Dave mentioned, one of our key findings was that physical maltreatment in childhood was actually the strongest predictor of aggression in adulthood. And what we argue is that this really does support this cycle of violence theory that's been around since the 80s, which basically says that if you've been exposed to or experienced violence in childhood, then you have an increased likelihood of engaging in aggression across the lifespan. And we know this can occur for a whole range of reasons that are related to the experience of trauma and a result of the experience of trauma. For example, we know that seeing aggression used within the home can lead young children to believe that's how conflict is managed, as Trav mentioned earlier, particularly if the child sees that using aggression achieves a desired goal, whatever that desired goal might be. The second thing, as Travis also mentioned earlier, and I'm going to draw a lot on things Travis said, so get ready. Maltreatment has a really profound impact on the brain, and it really does disrupt the brain development in areas that are necessary to make considered decisions, to think through the consequences of behavior, and to inhibit impulsive and risky behavior. Importantly, when you're living in a heightened stress state, so you're in fight-flight response, you've been in a stress state for a long period of time, as a result possibly of an experience of maltreatment, the use of aggression or violence might actually be seen as a good decision by that young person because it's about survival, it's about self-preservation, and therefore, actually, this is the right decision to make in this moment. So it can be incredibly complex, but what's important is that all of these things are considered when we're thinking about how to intervene. But we also see that these disruptions to cognitive functioning indirectly impact on aggressive behavior as well, because they also increase the risk of engaging in other risky behaviors. So, for example, you might make less good decisions about whether you should use substances to cope with your trauma, for example. It might seem like that's a great way to cope with your experiences of trauma. So your increased use then of substances to cope with your experiences may then lead you to making more risky decisions like aggression. So we can see these are all kind of linking in together to kind of produce a more complicated picture. So what's important for us then in terms of thinking about how to intervene is to understand the pattern of behavior in terms of all the risk factors and how they're coming together and what that looks like for the individual, to understand how they're co-occurring and what that might mean for intervention. Another thing to note here, again, is that in homes where there is maltreatment, there tends to be a high level of inconsistency. I know Travis also mentioned this. And because of this, the young person is trying to gain control over an unpredictable environment. If you don't know what's coming next, if you have no other means of gaining control in that environment, but you know aggression seems to get the desired outcome, you might be more likely to use it because it gives you that control that you desire, that you need, because control is a safe place. We like to be in control of our own lives. Next slide, please, Trav. Thank you. What we also found is that poor response inhibition is incredibly important where there's an experience of child maltreatment and when there's adult aggression. As Dave mentioned, response inhibition is this idea that you can stop a behavior from happening or delay a response from happening in the moment. It's this idea that you could respond immediately, but you take a moment to kind of stop and think through what you're about to do. Think about the consequences, make a decision about that behavior. If we're talking about aggression here, what we might be saying is, can you stop yourself reacting in the moment of provocation? So whatever that threat is, whatever the provocation is, can you stop yourself from sort of automatically responding? People with poor response inhibition would have great difficulty doing that because cognitively, they haven't developed that skill, or that skill is kind of, that part of their brain is not functioning the way it needs to enable them to stop and to actually implement a decision-making, slow, cognitive controlled process. And so the result is they may react aggressively before they've really had a chance to kind of process anything. And that's really important because that part of the brain that's responsible for response inhibition is impacted by maltreatment, it's impacted by substance use, and we know it's related to aggressive behavior. So it's very important. So what this means as well from an intervention perspective is that, again, we might deliver the most effective intervention. So we might be talking about here cognitive behavioral therapy for their aggressive behavior. But if we don't actually address the difficulty they have with response inhibition, even if they remember the information, even if they seem engaged, they've paid attention, they've taken it away, in the moment when there's provocation or threat, that will still revert back to the automatic response. The poor response inhibition still exists. So they might have the best intentions in the intervention, but put them in the real world situation, the experience of threat is too strong for their response inhibition. There's no cognitive control involved, and they are just not able to act in a controlled way in that moment. So there are ways that we can work on response inhibition, and a lot of the literature in the research is around kind of this idea of training response inhibition. And that basically looks like the task Dave spoke about earlier that we did with our participants. But you would actually present the individual with an aggressive, provoking situation, and you would ask them, when you hear a signal, we want you to stop yourself from responding. But if you don't hear the signal, you can respond. And the idea is that the more times we show them the aggressive situation, eventually, if we keep practicing this skill, they will develop this level of control over that behavior. They will stop responding impulsively. Now, that's not very real world. I can't imagine you're going to sit there with a client and say, here we go, like, let's do this task over a period of time. But there are things that you can do in the real world that have been shown to be effective, things like focusing on mindfulness. So what we really want to do is disrupt that process. So anything that for that individual that works to kind of in the moment get them to stop, whatever that looks like for them, that's what we're working on when we're talking about response inhibition. It's just getting them to take a second, allow their brain to catch up to what's happening and to start processing what's happening. And that could look like a range of things, and that could be very individualized as well. We know that drug use is a key factor. Now, we've known this for a long time in the aggression space. It impacts on aggressive behavior, but it impacts on your cognitive function, both when you're intoxicated, when you're withdrawing, and in fact, even up to a year after you've ceased using. The effects are really, really impactful on the brain. And often they're not picked up on because neuropsychological assessment is not a key part of routine clinical assessment. It's very expensive. We need very particularly trained psychologists to do it. There's often waiting lists. So there's a whole range of reasons that we don't often have access to this information. But it's important to know that, if you've got a client or a young person or an adult's been using substances for quite some time, there is a high likelihood there will be some cognitive impairment. And you may not know what that is, but you may be able to consider that it may be having an impact on their behavior and whether they can respond to intervention. Reiterating my point I've just made, which is that, often clinicians don't have information about cognitive impairment or cognitive status. And so this means you might not know what they are, like what the actual impairments might be for this person, and also how impaired the person might be. Like somebody might have some processing speed difficulties, so it might take them a bit longer to kind of process information, but it's still functional. So they can still kind of engage in everyday conversation. They can still do things, but we might not see the kind of direct impact it has until, we're requiring some very complex task from them, like engagement in a cognitive intervention. Often clinicians don't know, how long is this impairment going to last? And a lot of the time, if it's substance use related, the brain will return to regular functioning at some point. And we can also, we know the brain changes. We know the brain can change. We know we can work on the brain. So it's not all doom and gloom. We can absolutely work to improve the functioning of these areas, but also just being aware of them allows us to adapt our practice in the moment. There are some straightforward ways that you can modify interventions related to the key kind of executive function impairments that will have some impact. And that means we can kind of overcome some of the difficulties with more difficult interventions. But what's really important as well to note here is that, this might look like in practice, somebody not paying attention to what you're saying, somebody having difficulty, I don't want to read that. It's too hard. I'm not going to do it. Then they seem like they're not engaging. But what this could be is actually that they actually cognitively are having a lot of difficulty. And they might have been like this since school. If this disruption to the brain development happened in school, they might have dropped out of school. They might have had school troubles. And this has just been something that's carried on. And now in adulthood, they're having the same difficulties. And so it's important that we're considering that these might be having an underlying impact. I'm aware I'm running out of time. I'm so sorry, everyone. I'm trying to rush through these slides. More than happy to send them out as well so everyone has them. So knowing about maltreatment experience then means we can start to predict things about the future. So we now know that, well, if a child's experienced maltreatment, chances are they are at an increased risk of being aggressive in adulthood or across the lifespan, in fact, all the way through. So this not only means that we want to try and intervene with the child when they experience maltreatment. So, ideally, as soon as we know the earliest possible point, that's when we want to intervene, because what we could possibly do is disrupt this trajectory from maltreatment to aggression. And that's ideally what we want. However, even as an adult, working with an adult, even just knowing that this experience occurred in childhood changes the way we think about intervention. We start to think, okay, well, we know that this happened to them. So there's probably this cascade of effects on their life from there that are now going to impact their behavior as an adult, but also how we intervene with them as an adult. So just because we didn't intervene in childhood, which was ideal, does not mean it's a, lost cause. There's absolutely ways we can work with people when they've got these impairments, or even if the risk factors seem really far away from the current behavior. So I'm just seeing what I want to kind of touch on and focus on here, but what's important to know is that, there is interventions for young people who have experienced trauma. So there are services available, people who offer interventions at this time. But also we know that the literature tells us that trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy is quite promising for children who have experienced trauma. So it's, again, there's different interventions out there that have been adapted already that work in this kind of space, and ideally, again, applied very early on. But if we're talking about adulthood, again, it's just having that lens, knowing that it's occurred, knowing that it might have had these neurocognitive impacts. What might that mean for us now? How can we kind of think about that when we're working with these clients? The last thing to touch on is that we know that many people who use aggression in the home, young people, have experienced aggression and violence in the family. And I know we heard this in the last presentation, which means that we do need to consider the broader family context. We need to consider that there are a series of interactions that are occurring within the home. There are different dynamics between different dyadic relationships, triadic relationships within the family, and there are different situational factors that are all going to be playing a role in terms of why that young person might be using aggression. So a common example we hear from clinicians that we work with is that, and we're seeing it more in the literature, is things like taking away gaming devices is becoming a really big kind of trigger, or it's leading into this aggressive response. And we could argue like, yep, it's just because the young person loves this game and they want to keep playing. However, we could also look at this through a lens of cognitive functioning, where we could consider that if this person has experienced maltreatment and trauma, then they may already have some cognitive impairment going on that's making them more likely to respond aggressively. But if we look at this example here, what we also know is that things like video games and fast-paced media increase executive dysfunction. So what they're doing is things like TikTok, things like video games, they're using the part of our brain that's very emotional, that limbic system. It's all about our emotions in the moment. What it's not doing is engaging in our higher order processes, our executive processes. It's not using the parts of our brain like problem solving, like cognitive control, like making good decisions. And so those parts become underused. And if we're not using them, we're essentially creating this kind of executive dysfunction, both in the moment and over the long term. And this can increase the likelihood of aggression in the moment as well. So there are a bunch of situational factors that are relevant for us and a bunch of kind of further away factors, the broader contextual factors. But executive dysfunction, or this idea of cognitive ability, seems to have a role to play in any which angle you look at it from. And all of it matters because it matters for intervention. We can have the best practitioners, the best intervention. If we're not considering that these people can't respond to it because it's cognitively too difficult for them, for whatever reason, whatever impairments they might have, then we're going to get, low effectiveness rates. It's going to appear like our interventions don't work, when in actual fact, it may just be that we can make some adjustments to allow for more people to engage. Okay, I think we are now on our last slide. What I will just say before we jump into questions, and again, I know we're out of time, I'm so sorry, we've got 5 minutes, is that we work a lot with clinical services. So we work a lot in this space trying to unpack what's happening. And so we would love, if anybody wants to talk further about anything related to the work they're doing, we would love to chat more about it and think more about what it can mean for our work. Our work is very clinically informed. We want to know what's working on the ground and what's not working on the ground, and that's where we base ourselves. We're not as researchy in that way. We really want to make sure that that this is relevant. So we'd love to hear from you if you want to reach out. Okay, I'm officially done. Sorry, Carolyn.
No, please don't apologize. You're getting lots of emoji love and applause and thumbs up. So I think that's a good sign. Look, thank you so much for going through that. And I appreciate you've just condensed a huge amount of work and research into a very short time frame. So thank you. I just wanted to point out, there was a couple of points throughout the presentations where you sort of said, oh, you probably know this, and actually, I think we need to hear those things more. We need to be really making sure that from a research and a advocacy and policy point of view, we are repeating some of these messages. And I want to preface, none of this content is about ever excusing violence or the use of aggressive and disrespectful behavior, but it's absolutely about making sure that our understanding of the causes and the drivers of aggression are sound, so that our service responses have any chance of being effective. So I really liked the way that you had split that up. You've talked about social learning and the reality of that inconsistent parenting that can happen alongside child maltreatment. That yes, learned responses of what behaviours might work for a person, but it's not just about that, is it? You've talked quite a lot there about the neurobiological changes that happen earlier in childhood. And I really liked how you set out a use of proactive violence, where a person is using planned aggression to get what they want, but also that reactive violence, which is a response to something that is triggering. So I think it bears repeating to make sure that we have that really nuanced understanding that in some cases, yes, an individual has absolutely chosen strategically to use violence, but in other cases, there are other types of interventions that we need to include to make sure that we're capturing the full range of reasons and scenarios where aggression and violence occur. There's a couple of questions. I might just add a couple. I understand people may drop off and but they can tune into the recording at a later point. One thing I did want to pick up on was that you've spoken about how the effects of childhood maltreatment can basically impact on a person's ability to engage with interventions that are designed to support them. And so from a practitioner or clinician point of view, a person might appear disengaged or disinterested, but actually they are genuinely having difficulties participating. So from your own points of view, what does this mean then for programs that do require a lot of buy-in from people to participate, or programs that have very short stipulated timeframes for program intervention?
Sorry. All right. I'll step it now. Ash, you can go if you like. I suppose that one of the key things, and this probably leads a little bit more into the questions that we got from Berenice and Shasta. One of the main things that we see, and one of the difficulties, and Trav was speaking about this with that sort of treatment intervention responsivity, is we really have to know what the specific deficit is or what the specific dysregulation is in order to actually find the right type of intervention. So there's a question here about so we've got family violence interventions that focus a lot of impulse control and decision makings. But if that's not the specific dysregulation, or if that's only part of the dysregulation, and all these things are connected, so you can't really have one that's necessarily independent of any other. So that response inhibition, that ability to stop impulsive acts, if that's already been disrupted by some other process in the brain, your ability to kind of get on top of that is going to be harder. So we really need to have a full idea of where those deficits are, where that dysregulation occurs, and what we can do about it. So again, for example, if someone's in this situation and we're trying to address impulsivity specifically, but their actual main deficit is in something like working memory, then our ability to give them instructions, our ability to get them to engage with an intervention or materials or resources is going to be hampered almost immediately. It's almost a non-starter across the board. We'll give someone 2 or 3 instructions and they've already forgotten the first 2. And so we're already hamstrung. And the second point here, and I'll very quickly bounce it back to Ash and Trav on this one. One of them, also the biggest problems that we have, is that the things that contribute to childhood maltreatment tend to be, for lack of a better word, they tend to be something that's more cognitively interesting, cognitively important to someone. So the experience of this maltreatment is cognitively important, it is developmentally important, cognitively interesting and important in a way that something like engaging in a therapy or engaging in intervention isn't. So those things that happen in childhood tend to cast a very large shadow that's hard to overcome in adulthood, particularly when you think about how much faster the brain's developing and changing in childhood versus when it's changing and developing in adulthood. It does change, and it can change, and it will change over time. It's just a lot harder with the tools that we have in adulthood as opposed to how easy it is to damage in childhood. Sorry, Ash.
I didn't have anything to add on top of that, Dave. I think you're right. I think that this, one of the biggest issues we have in this field is lack of screening around cognitive impairment. It's something we've been working a lot on in different settings because, like I mentioned, neuropsychological testing it's expensive. There's waiting lists. It takes a long time to do it. It takes a lot of effort from the client as well. It can be 2 or 3 hours of just sitting and doing tests, which if you've got impairments is a huge undertaking, and it might take multiple sessions. So what we're working on a lot is trying to find very short, sharp screening tools or checklists that we can use to say, hey, this person presented with 7 out of 8 of these items. It's very likely they've got an impairment in these areas. Yes, you could refer them to an assessment, and yes, they can go on a waiting list and great. But in the interim, you could make an assumption that they might need some support around these things. So that's something we're working a lot on, because we understand that practically that's more valuable in the interim to give, practitioners and clinicians something to work with than to be waiting around for full assessments when you might lose the client in the meantime, or, things could escalate or anything could happen. So yeah, as Dave said, it's what's important for us and what we're working towards is this mapping. What does this person need? But balancing that with what's practical in clinical work. We can't just have an individualized intervention for everyone, and we understand that. But where we can, we want to give that information to the people working with the clients to inform their practice, and sort of work with them on how that could happen without having to every single person have an individual intervention.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. Yeah, so look, I think what you've kind of hit on here is we do have we do have some really good insights from a theoretical and a psychological point of view. It's about finding a good fit, as you kept referring to, Ashley, in the real world. So what does it actually mean for a person to engage or to go through, the sort of usual or the preferred assessment processes. I think just in the interest of time, I'm afraid we are going to have to wrap things up today. I did like and take note of the fact that you've offered for people to get in touch, and I think we've already had a few people in the comments saying they would love to do that. I think a lot of people here would be very interested to shoot the breeze and talk about this topic at length. So I think you found some very interested colleagues along the way. If there are a couple of questions, I'll try to maybe gauge your interest in providing a written response to that, but we'll certainly package up the recording today. Someone's asked for a few of the slides, so I'll check in with you if that's okay, and we'll send out to everyone who has registered. So just want to thank you again so much for all your time and effort today in speaking to us about this study. I think it has some pretty some pretty big findings and really relevant insights for us who have joined today. Thank you for our audience members too who have joined in. As you exit, you should be prompted to complete just a quick survey, which we would love you to do, just to gain some insights about how you've found this webinar. We have another webinar coming up in another fortnight's time from another researcher, this time from the University of Queensland, who's looking at children's voices, children and young people who have been using child to parent or child to mother violence and aggression. I think Emma's popped that in the chat for us. Okay, I think that's everything for today. But yeah, thank you again for everyone who has joined us, and we look forward to seeing you all again sometime soon. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Carolyn.
Thank you.